So behind us is our T25 Magnum with its newly fitted Golf GTI engine. Obviously the next thing we need to do before I even drive this down the road, so it starts, it runs, but we need to make sure it stops. So our next point is to check the brakes out and see where they're at. Okay, a quick inspection reveals that they're pretty grotty. So the first thing we're going to do is remove this because we're going to fit new discs and pads to the front. First thing we need to do is remove our brake caliper. Now it's held onto the brake caliper yoke by two 13mm bolts, one at the top and one at the bottom. Before I do that, I need to move the brake caliper over so I can have the brake pads clear the disc to remove it, because there's a bit of a lip on the disc and we'll struggle otherwise. So I'm going to use a big screwdriver going this side, and I'm going to pull the brake caliper across, so I'm compressing the piston nice and gently and slowly, and then that should give us a bit of free movement, which it has now, so that will allow our brake pads to come past our lip on our disc. So our 13mm bolt fits on here, and then our slim 17mm goes in and holds that steady so we can undo our bolt. Once both of our bolts are out, we can actually wiggle the caliper off, so it's pretty crusty. I'm going to hang that up with the use of a cable tie. You can use a piece of wire if need be. I don't want to stress our flexi hose. So, and it just stops the stress on our flexi hose. So we're going to gently tease our knackered old pads out that are really rusty and tight in there. There's one. Yeah, they wouldn't work very well at all. These pads need to move freely in this yoke, so when the caliper squeezes, it squeezes against the disc. As you can hear, these are very tight. They're corroded in. I have a 22mm socket on a big bar because these bolts behind that hold this yoke on are going to be very tight. So you might need to take a bit of care and make sure your vehicle is supported really well, because you're going to have to give this a good tug to get this to go. Here we go. Yeah, so that's pretty tight. We can go ahead and remove those. Both bolts are loose. We'll take those out and we can actually remove the yoke. As you can see, he's pretty crusty, so we're going to get that all cleaned up. Although our sliders still work well. So again, we want to make sure these aren't seized up, and they're not, that's good. Just wants a good clean, I think. You see how those pads were rusted in. Now what we have left to do is to undo the hub nut. So that is a 27. And I'll undo that. Assembly off, that's the whole assembly off with the washer. Over to the bench. This is our crusty old brake disc, looking pretty sad for itself. This is our shiny new one. Now these new brake discs, they come quite heavily oiled to prevent corrosion whilst they're sat around or in transport. So before we actually fit it to the vehicle and put our brake pads on it, we will do a proper degrease. But for now, it doesn't really matter because we've got to put our bearings in now. So what we get in our wheel bearing package, a big bearing and a little bearing, an outer and an inner bearing with its race, a nice grease seal to go on the back, and a new locking nut as well for the front. So the first thing we need to do is open this up. And this is our bearing race. This is the face that the actual bearing rolls against. We need to make sure we get that round the right way. So we want the taper that way. It goes in from behind. And we can either press that in on a press. If you don't have a press, you can use a proper bearing tool, which I'll show you. Or you can find a socket or a piece of tube that's the same diameter that you can start drifting it in with. This is our bearing tool, and this fits neatly inside our race. And allows us to push it in place. So this part fits to there. Just screw that on so it doesn't fall off. And then with our hammer we can use this to drift our bearing race in. So sit it on there nice and square. Just start gently tapping it in. You see it's moved in quite nicely. So I'm just going to check and make sure it's nice and square and it's not cocked up to one side, which it isn't, so that's good. We can keep going with that. That noise. So that's nice and solid now, so we know that our race is sat down inside the correct part of our hub stroke disc assembly. Our bearing tool for the smaller bearing, so again the bearing fits snugly into that. Put that onto our tool there. Screw them on so it doesn't fall off. Wait for the noise. That's it done, seated. Both bearing races nicely seated in our hub stroke disc assembly. So time to grease our bearing. So I'm going to take the larger two bearings, which is our inner bearing, and we're going to feed it with grease. So it's very important not to over grease these and obviously not under grease them. Under grease them, there's not enough lubrication, they get hot very quickly. Over grease them, they get hot very quickly and throw the grease out. So, wheel bearing grease, take a bit with clean gloves on, and we're going to work the grease into the bearing, not just smother the bearing on the outside, but actually work it through the rollers and push it through. So you can do it in your palm. If you want to put some grease in your palm, push it through that way, that's fine. Just move the bearing round, and we're pushing that grease between those rollers. It's now time to put our grease seal in the back. Here's our seal. And when we look at our seal, there's a hollow part. Now that needs to face inwards and our solid part face outwards. Also, when you look at the actual lip seal part inside, it should face inwards as well. So we're going to push him in from behind again. Quite tight, so it will need drifting in. We're going to use our bearing drift tool. So this time I'm going to turn it over and use that as a seal drifting tool. Again, you can find a socket that fits nicely or a piece of tube that fits nicely to the seal and gently knock it in. You can also tap it in with a rubber mallet to get it going and get it flat. It's quite tricky, but it can be done. A bit easier with our seal tool like this. And we're just going to gently start tapping at it because we want to make sure that it goes in straight. If the seal goes in not straight, it can be a real pain to get back out. Like now, if you see one side going down further than the other, then you need to favour the opposite side now. So I'm going to try and put a bit more pressure on this side. We'll keep going until that seal's flush with our hub assembly. And that's it. All we have left to do now is grease our small or outer bearing. That won't fall out of there now, we've got our grease seal in, so that's life easier. Turn that over. So this one fits in the front or on the outer part. And again, same process with the grease. That's our grease forced into the bearing, ready to go into our hub assembly. The only thing we need to retain from our old parts is the washer that goes on the outside. I'll give that a wipe, that's a bit grubby. That's it, ready for that assembly to go back on the vehicle. We're now ready to refit our disc and hub assembly back onto our stub axle. First thing I want to check though is just make sure that the area where our grease seal touches on our stub axle, make sure that's clean and free from grit and that it's nice and smooth and there aren't any rough indentations, because that could damage our grease seal. I'm just giving it a wipe round so I can see the condition of the stub axle, and it looks really good. So we can simply slide our assembly on. So here's our complete assembly with the bearings in. Now you can take the little front bearing out if you want to, if you're not happy with or confident with keeping it in whilst you're putting the hub on, because it sometimes can get a bit wobbly and they fall out. So if you're more comfortable with that, I'd say take that out because you don't want to get grit and dirt in there from when it hits the floor, because you have to clean it and re-grease it again. Notice I'm keeping hold of our outer bearing. Now we're on. Seated back lovely. Can now fit our washer and then fit our new hub nut. We're just going to nip that up for starters, and then I'll show you how to adjust it correctly. So we're going to tighten our hub nut up. This is a roller taper type bearing. So the first thing we need to do from a fresh bearing like this is do it up tight. I'm using a standard size ratchet. So we do it until it doesn't go any further. I don't want to now move the bearing because that could damage it. So what we've done, we've seated the bearing correctly in the races. We've squeezed all the grease out of the relevant areas so the bearings are touching where they should do. And then we're just going to back it off. So we back it off, and this time when we do it up, we're going to go nice and gentle, just put a tiny, once we start feeling that tiny little bit of resistance, just a teensy bit there, and that will do. We're going to stay there for the moment. We'll do the last piece of adjustment with the wheel on, and then we can knock over the locking part of our hub nut when we're completely 100% happy with our adjustment. Next part is to remember to degrease this disc before we go any further. We don't want to start fitting brake components to a very greasy, oily disc. It will contaminate our pads. So before we go any further, let's get that cleaned up. So brake cleaner. Then remember to do the back side as well. Don't just do the front of the disc, to do both sides. Okay, thoroughly degreased, ready to put pads on. We're ready to refit our caliper carrier or caliper yoke. Clean this up with a wire brush because it was quite corroded and we did struggle to get the pads out. I had to use a screwdriver to lever them out. So a wire brush on both faces, got that nice and clean, and now our pad fits in and is able to move also. Other thing just to double check is make sure that your sliders move okay and that the boots aren't split. You can remove the sliders and put some fresh grease in there, or put some copper grease in there. We'll take our big caliper carrier bolts. Just going to spin those in using our fingers. Now we can get ready to torque those up. This type of system with the sliding caliper, those carrier bolts need to be done up to 270 Newton meters, so that's fairly tight. If you've got a fixed caliper, it's 160 Newton meters. So let's get our torque wrench and get that torqued up. Torque wrench set to 270 Newton meters with a 22mm socket. Let's see if we can get these tightened up. Again, we're going to try and go nice and evenly, so a bit on each. Don't try and do one big bolt at a time. Two. That's our carrier nice and tight. So we're ready to fit our brake pads. I'm going to try and fit them first. So we put both in to our caliper carrier. As you see, they both move nice and freely now because we've cleaned our carrier up. So I'm happy with those. So we're going to put copper grease on these and get them into our carrier. When applying copper grease to your brake pad, you want to put them right on the edge and the end and across the face where either the caliper carrier touches or the brake caliper piston touches. So this is going to be our inside one. So I'm going to put anti-seizure or copper grease where the piston touches, and then where it touches onto the caliper carrier, a small dab on there as well. Next, we're going to make sure that the piston's all the way back in the caliper. So if you remember, I cable tied it to our spring. So I turn it over, I'm going to grab my big pliers, gently and evenly squeeze the piston back into the caliper. Place over the top of our new brake pads. In our brake pad kit we get brand new slider bolts, so we're going to put those in. The pads are sprung, so you will have to put a little bit of force on the caliper for our bolt hole to line up. So we do that so we can get the last bolt in. And then we torque those up. There's a torque setting for those, they're 35 Newton meters. So we need our 17mm slim spanner to hold the other side, and then we'll torque up with our torque wrench. Our torque wrench set at 35 Newton meters and our 17mm slim spanner. Our next job is to put the wheel on, and then we just finish adjusting our wheel bearing, and then we can knock our locking part of our hub nut over. Popped our wheel back on with a few bolts and left the centre cap out, just so we can finalise our adjustment of our wheel bearing. From top to bottom and rock it, I can feel there's just a tiny weeny bit of play in there. So I'm going to take that little bit of play out, just a tiny bit more. Remember, we didn't do this very tight at all. A tiny bit more. Nearly there. That's about half the amount of play that I had. And now nothing. You are allowed a little bit of play, so we adjust until there's no play. Once that wheel bearing is settled in, there will be a tiny little amount, which is fine. So we can go ahead and knock over our locking part of our hub nut now. So using a small punch and a hammer, I'm going to knock the locking part of our hub nut down. That was how to fit front brake discs and pads with wheel bearings on a T25. For more how-to videos, follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, or check us out at justkampers.com. Thanks for watching.